The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time that day. At 28 years old, he had been serving as one of the Queen's Guard for nearly 6 years, and the weight of his bearskin hat no longer bothered him the way it had during his first months on duty. The tourists were already gathering in small clusters beyond the gates, cameras ready to capture the iconic image of the stoic guards in their scarlet uniforms. James had grown up in a modest household in Yorkshire, where his father worked as a coal miner and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the neighboring towns. The idea of serving the crown had always filled him with pride, and when he was accepted into the Grenadier Guards after his military training, his parents had wept with joy. They had saved every penny to attend his passing-out parade, his mother wearing her best dress, and his father in a suit that had seen better days but was pressed to perfection for the occasion. Standing at his post near the main entrance, James maintained the rigid posture that had been drilled into him through countless hours of training. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but his peripheral vision caught every movement in the courtyard. He had learned to read the crowd, to distinguish between the harmless tourists snapping photos and the occasional troublemaker who might try to provoke a reaction from the guards. The morning had been relatively quiet, with the usual stream of visitors admiring the palace architecture and posing for pictures at a respectful distance. James's mind wandered briefly to his younger sister Sarah, who was studying nursing at university. She had written to him just last week, thanking him for the money he sent home each month to help with her education. It was a sacrifice he made gladly, knowing that his military salary, while modest, could make a difference in her future. As the clock tower chimed 11, James noticed a commotion near the palace gates. A sleek black Bentley had pulled up to the VIP entrance, its chrome bumpers gleaming in the sunlight. The driver, wearing a crisp uniform and white gloves, stepped out and moved quickly to open the rear door. From the vehicle emerged a man who immediately commanded attention, though not necessarily for the right reasons. Marcus Whitmore was 45 years old and worth approximately £40 million, a fortune he had inherited from his late father's shipping empire and had since multiplied through shrewd but often ruthless business dealings. Standing at average height, but carrying himself with an air of superiority that made him seem taller, Marcus surveyed his surroundings with the calculating gaze of someone who was accustomed to having the world bend to his will. His suit was hand-tailored from the finest Italian wool, and his shoes were crafted by a boutique cobbler in London who charged more for a single pair than most people earned in a month. A gold Patek Philippe watch adorned his wrist, its value enough to pay for a comfortable middle-class lifestyle for several years. Everything about Marcus's appearance spoke of wealth and privilege, but there was something else in his demeanor that made people instinctively uncomfortable in his presence. Marcus had been invited to a private reception at the palace, one of several such events held throughout the year to acknowledge significant charitable contributions or business achievements. His invitation had come as a result of his company's recent donation to a children's hospital, though those familiar with Marcus's character understood that such gestures were typically motivated more by tax benefits and public relations than genuine altruism. As Marcus approached the entrance where James stood guard, his phone rang. The ringtone was unnecessarily loud, a classical piece that seemed designed to announce his importance to anyone within earshot. Without any regard for palace protocol or common courtesy, Marcus answered the call immediately, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Whitmore here," he barked into the phone, his tone sharp and impatient. "I don't care what the contractors are saying about delays. I want that building project finished by the end of the month, and if they can't meet the deadline, find contractors who can. I'm not paying overtime for their incompetence." James remained motionless, his training allowing him to ignore the distraction, but he couldn't help but notice the dismissive way Marcus spoke to whoever was on the other end of the call. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Marcus becoming increasingly agitated and his language growing more abusive toward the unfortunate person who had called with what was apparently unwelcome news. "Listen carefully," Marcus continued, his voice rising, "because I'm only going to say this once. If this project isn't completed on schedule, I'll make sure every contractor in London knows exactly how incompetent your company is. You'll never work in this city again. Do I make myself clear?" The tourists in the courtyard had begun to take notice of Marcus's behavior, some looking uncomfortable at witnessing such an aggressive conversation in such a dignified setting. Parents guided their children away from the area, and several visitors exchanged worried glances. The contrast between Marcus's crude behavior and the solemnity of the palace setting was stark and unsettling. After ending his call, Marcus barely glanced at the ornate architecture surrounding him. Where others might have felt humbled by the history and grandeur of the royal residence, Marcus seemed to view it as just another building, perhaps impressive by ordinary standards, but certainly not beyond his own sphere of influence and wealth. As he strode toward the entrance, Marcus noticed James standing at attention in his immaculate red uniform. For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's eyes, a look that suggested he viewed the young guard not as a person deserving of respect, but as nothing more than a decorative element, like a statue or a piece of furniture placed there for his amusement. "Excuse me," Marcus called out, his voice carrying a tone of mock politeness that barely concealed his condescension. "You there, guard?" James remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed straight ahead as his training demanded. The Queen's Guard were not supposed to respond to casual attempts at conversation from visitors, and James had successfully ignored countless such attempts over his years of service. But there was something in Marcus's tone that suggested this interaction might not end as simply as the others. "I said excuse me," Marcus repeated, this time louder and with obvious irritation. "Are you deaf, or just too stupid to respond when your betters are speaking to you?" A few tourists had gathered at a distance, sensing that something unusual was developing. Some had their cameras ready, though they weren't sure what they might be about to witness. The atmosphere in the courtyard had shifted subtly, with an undercurrent of tension that made everyone present feel slightly uncomfortable. James continued to maintain his position, though inside he felt his jaw tighten slightly at Marcus's words. He had endured similar provocations before, usually from drunk tourists or attention-seeking visitors. But there was something particularly grating about Marcus's tone and choice of words. Still, his training held firm, and he showed no outward reaction to the insult. Marcus stepped closer to James, now standing just a few feet away from the guard. His expensive cologne created an almost suffocating cloud in the immediate area, and his eyes held a look that suggested he was enjoying the power dynamic he perceived in the situation. "You know," Marcus said, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow made his words even more menacing. "I pay more in taxes in a single month than you probably earn in an entire year. In a very real sense, my money pays your salary. So when I speak to you, the least you could do is show some acknowledgement." The tourists who had been watching were now clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Several had moved farther away, while others remained frozen in place, uncertain whether they should intervene or simply avoid getting involved in what was clearly an inappropriate situation. James felt his heart rate increase slightly, but his external appearance remained unchanged. He had been trained to handle various forms of provocation, and his instructors had emphasized that maintaining composure under pressure was one of the most important aspects of his role. The Queen's Guard represented not just the military, but the dignity and stability of the entire institution they served. Marcus, however, seemed to interpret James's continued silence as a personal challenge to his authority. His face began to redden slightly, and his voice took on a harder edge as he continued his verbal assault. "Perhaps you don't understand the situation here," Marcus said, his words coming faster now. "I'm not some common tourist taking pictures for my scrapbook. I'm here by invitation, which means I'm someone of importance, someone whose time and presence matter. You, on the other hand, are nothing more than a dressed-up mannequin, a piece of pageantry for the entertainment of visitors." The words stung more than James cared to admit, not because they threatened his ego, but because they demonstrated such a fundamental lack of respect for the service and sacrifice that he and his fellow guards represented. James thought of his grandfather, who had served in World War II and had often spoken about the honor of serving one's country. He thought of his fellow guards, many of whom had served in Afghanistan or other conflict zones before taking on their ceremonial duties. But Marcus wasn't finished. He had clearly decided that James's continued silence was unacceptable, and his next words revealed the depth of his contempt not just for James personally, but for everyone he considered beneath his social and economic status. "You know what I think?" Marcus continued, his voice now loud enough that tourists throughout the courtyard could hear every word. "I think you people forget your place. You get a fancy uniform, and suddenly, you think you're somebody important, somebody worthy of respect. But the truth is, you're nothing more than a servant, and not even a particularly useful one at that." James felt his muscles tense involuntarily, though his outward appearance remained unchanged. The insult to his service was bad enough, but Marcus's reference to "you people" carried implications that went beyond mere rudeness. It suggested the confrontation was attracting more attention now, with palace security personnel beginning to take notice of the disturbance. However, they remained at their posts, watching carefully but not yet intervening, as Marcus was technically an invited guest and had not yet crossed any clear lines that would justify his removal. Marcus seemed to sense that he had an audience, and rather than being deterred by the attention, he appeared to feed off it. His voice grew even louder, and his gestures became more dramatic as he continued his verbal assault on James. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Marcus demanded, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "I employ hundreds of people. I contribute millions to the economy. I fund charities and support causes that actually matter. What do? You stand there in your costume and pretend to be important while contributing absolutely nothing of value to society." The tourists watching the scene were clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Several had begun to whisper among themselves, and more than a few were shaking their heads in obvious disapproval of Marcus's behavior. Some had started to move away from the area entirely, unwilling to continue watching what had become an ugly display of privilege and arrogance. James remained steadfast in his position, though internally he was fighting a battle between his training and his natural human response to such blatant disrespect. He thought about his sister Sarah again, and how proud she had been when he first put on his uniform. He thought about his parents, who had raised him to believe in the dignity of honest work and service to others, regardless of the recognition or compensation it might bring. But Marcus was far from finished with his tirade. Having failed to provoke any visible reaction from James, he seemed determined to escalate the situation further. His next words would cross a line that even the most patient observer would find difficult to tolerate. "You're pathetic," Marcus spat, his face now fully flushed with anger at James's continued refusal to respond. "Standing there like a robot, pretending to have some kind of dignity when everyone can see you for what you really are. You're a failure, a nobody who couldn't succeed at anything meaningful in life, so you ended up playing dress-up for tourists." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and even some of the tourists who had been merely uncomfortable before now looked genuinely shocked at Marcus's cruelty. The attack had moved beyond mere rudeness into the realm of genuine malice, and it was clear that Marcus was no longer simply trying to get a reaction from James, but was actively attempting to humiliate and degrade him in front of witnesses. James felt something shift inside him, a dangerous stirring of anger that he had to consciously suppress. His training had prepared him for many things, but the sustained verbal assault he was experiencing went beyond anything he had encountered in his years of service. Still, he maintained his composure, drawing on reserves of self-control that he hadn't known he possessed. Marcus, however, seemed to interpret James's continued silence as victory rather than strength. His next action would prove to be the moment when his arrogance and contempt finally overcame whatever minimal sense of decency he might have retained. Without warning, and with a look of absolute disgust on his face, Marcus drew back his head and spat directly at James, the saliva striking the guard's immaculate red tunic just below his medals. The moment Marcus Whitmore's spit struck James Mitchell's uniform, time seemed to freeze in the palace courtyard. The tourists who had been watching the confrontation gasped audibly, their cameras forgotten as they witnessed something that went far beyond ordinary rudeness into the realm of genuine assault. The morning air, which had been filled with the usual sounds of conversation and footsteps, fell into a stunned silence. James felt the warm, disgusting wetness seep through his tunic, and, for a split second, his carefully maintained composure wavered. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to respond, to wipe away the humiliation and defend his honor in the most direct way possible. His hands, which had remained perfectly still at his sides throughout Marcus's verbal assault, twitched almost imperceptibly as his mind processed what had just occurred. 6 years of military discipline, countless hours of preparation for exactly this type of situation, and an ingrained respect for the institution he served all combined to keep him rooted in place. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of the internal struggle taking place, but his feet remained planted, and his eyes stayed fixed straight ahead. Marcus stood there for a moment, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face as he observed what he perceived to be his complete dominance over the situation. In his mind, he had just demonstrated the natural order of things, putting someone he considered inferior firmly in their place. The fact that James hadn't responded only confirmed Marcus's belief that the guard was exactly what he had claimed, a powerless nobody who could be treated with impunity. However, Marcus had severely underestimated both James as an individual and the broader implications of his actions. What he saw as a moment of triumph was actually the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately destroy everything he had spent his life building. The first consequence of Marcus's actions became apparent within seconds of the spitting incident. Among the tourists who had witnessed the assault was Emma Richardson, a freelance journalist who had been visiting the palace with her family during a brief vacation in London. Emma's background was in investigative reporting, and she had developed a keen eye for recognizing when seemingly small incidents had the potential to become much larger stories. Emma had been recording the confrontation on her phone from the moment Marcus's voice had grown loud enough to disturb other visitors. Initially, she had been capturing what she thought might be an interesting example of tourist behavior gone wrong, the kind of minor incident that sometimes made for amusing social media content. But, as Marcus's verbal assault had escalated, and particularly after the spitting incident, Emma realized she had documented something far more significant. The video Emma had captured was clear and comprehensive. It showed Marcus arriving at the palace, his phone conversation, his initial attempts to provoke James, the escalating verbal abuse, and, finally, the moment when he spat on the guard's uniform. The audio quality was excellent, capturing not only Marcus's words but also the shocked reactions of other witnesses. Most importantly, the video clearly showed James's professionalism throughout the ordeal, his refusal to be provoked, and the dignity with which he endured the assault. Emma's journalistic instincts told her that this video had the potential to become a major news story. The combination of class conflict, military honor, and outrageous behavior by a wealthy individual contained all the elements that modern media consumers found irresistible. But Emma also recognized that the story was about more than just one incident. It was about broader issues of respect, privilege, and the way society treats those who serve in public roles. As Emma discreetly continued recording, she noticed that palace security was finally beginning to respond to the situation. Two officers in dark suits had emerged from a side entrance and were walking purposefully toward where Marcus and James stood. Their expressions were serious but controlled, suggesting they had been trained to handle sensitive situations involving both VIP guests and the dignity of the royal household. The senior security officer, a man named Detective Inspector William Thompson, had been working palace security for over 15 years. He had dealt with everything from drunk tourists to potential security threats, but the situation he was now approaching presented unique challenges. Marcus was an invited guest, which complicated any response, but his behavior had clearly crossed into criminal territory with the assault on James. Inspector Thompson approached Marcus with a kind of measured professionalism that comes from years of experience in delicate situations. His tone was respectful but firm as he addressed the wealthy businessman. "Sir," Thompson said, "I'm going to need to ask you to come with me. There's been an incident that requires our immediate attention." Marcus turned to face the security officer, and, for a moment, his confident demeanor faltered slightly. He had been so focused on his confrontation with James that he hadn't noticed the gathering crowd of witnesses or the fact that his behavior was attracting official attention. However, his moment of uncertainty was brief, and his arrogance quickly reasserted itself. "An incident?" Marcus replied, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm not sure what you mean. I was simply having a conversation with your guard here, though I must say he's remarkably unresponsive. Perhaps you need to provide better customer service training for your staff." Thompson's expression didn't change, but Emma, who was still recording from her position among the tourists, caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was less than impressed with Marcus's attempt to minimize what had occurred. "Sir," Thompson repeated, his voice maintaining its professional tone, "spitting on a member of the Queen's Guard constitutes assault under British law. I need you to accompany me so we can discuss this situation in a more appropriate setting." The word assault seemed to strike Marcus like a physical blow. For the first time since the incident began, his confident facade cracked visibly. He had clearly expected that his wealth and status would insulate him from any serious consequences for his actions. The suggestion that he might actually face legal repercussions for what he considered a minor expression of his displeasure was evidently something that had never occurred to him. "Assault?" Marcus sputtered, his voice rising again. "That's absolutely ridiculous. I barely touched him. And even if I did, what does it matter? He's just a guard." Surely you have more important things to worry about than protecting the feelings of some ceremonial soldier. Thompson's patience was clearly being tested, but his professionalism remained intact. Years of dealing with entitled individuals had taught him that the best approach was often to remain calm and let their own behavior condemn them. "Sir," Thompson said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge, "every member of the Queen's Guard is a serving soldier in the British Army. They have completed multiple deployments in combat zones and have earned the right to be treated with respect and dignity. What you did constitutes a criminal offense, regardless of your personal opinions about their role." Emma continued to record the exchange, recognizing that Thompson's response was providing crucial context that would make her eventual story even more compelling. The security officer's words highlighted the disconnect between Marcus's perception of the guards as mere decorations and the reality of their service and sacrifice. Marcus's face was now fully flushed, whether from anger, embarrassment, or some combination of both was difficult to determine. His next words would prove to be among the most damaging he could have chosen, demonstrating that even when faced with official consequences for his behavior, he remained completely unrepentant. "This is absolutely absurd," Marcus declared, his voice loud enough to carry throughout the courtyard. "I contribute millions to this country's economy. I employ hundreds of people. I pay more in taxes than most people earn in their entire lifetimes. And you're threatening me over some minor altercation with a glorified museum piece." The tourists who were still in the area looked increasingly uncomfortable with Marcus's continued outbursts. Several parents had guided their children away from the scene, and others were shaking their heads in obvious disapproval. Emma noticed that several other people appeared to be recording the incident as well, suggesting that multiple versions of the story would likely emerge. Thompson's response was measured but firm. "Sir, your economic contributions don't give you the right to assault anyone, regardless of their occupation or social status. British law applies to everyone equally, and that includes wealthy businessmen and members of the royal family alike." Marcus seemed genuinely shocked by Thompson's unwillingness to defer to his status and wealth. Throughout his adult life, he had grown accustomed to having problems disappear through the application of money, influence, or both. The idea that his wealth might not protect him from the consequences of his actions was clearly a foreign concept. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Marcus demanded, his voice taking on a desperate quality that suggested his confidence was beginning to erode. "I have connections throughout the government and the business community. I can make one phone call and have your career ended before lunch." Thompson's expression remained unchanged, but Emma caught what might have been the slightest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Marcus's threats were clearly having the opposite of their intended effect, serving only to demonstrate how out of touch he was with the reality of his situation. "Sir," Thompson replied calmly, "those connections won't be relevant to the criminal charges you may be facing. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time to accompany me voluntarily. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest here in front of all these witnesses." The threat of public arrest finally seemed to penetrate Marcus's arrogance. He looked around the courtyard for the first time since the incident began, taking in the crowd of tourists, the cameras, and the general atmosphere of disapproval that surrounded him. For a moment, he appeared to be calculating the potential damage to his reputation if he were to be handcuffed and led away in front of dozens of witnesses. Meanwhile, James remained at his post throughout the entire exchange. His training required him to maintain his position unless specifically relieved by a superior officer, and no such order had been given. However, the continuing presence of spit on his uniform was a constant reminder of the humiliation he had endured, and he could feel the eyes of tourists and security personnel alike watching for any sign of how he was handling the situation. Internally, James was processing the events with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal anger. On one hand, he was pleased to see that Marcus was facing consequences for his behavior. The fact that palace security was treating the incident seriously validated both James's service and the broader principle that no one should be able to assault others with impunity, regardless of their wealth or status. On the other hand, James was still dealing with the emotional impact of what had occurred. The verbal abuse had been difficult enough, but the physical assault represented a level of disrespect that went beyond anything he had experienced in his military career. He had been spat on by a man who clearly viewed him as less than human, and that knowledge burned inside him despite his outward composure. Emma Richardson, still recording from her position among the tourists, was already beginning to formulate the story she would write. She could see that this incident had all the elements necessary to capture public attention. A clear case of wealthy privilege clashing with working-class dignity, a respected institution being disrespected, and a perpetrator whose behavior was so outrageous that it demanded public accountability. But Emma also recognized that the story was bigger than just the incident itself. Marcus's behavior was symptomatic of broader societal issues about class, respect, and the way wealth and power are often used to shield people from the consequences of their actions. The story she would eventually write would need to address these larger themes while remaining focused on the specific injustice that had occurred. As Thompson continued to negotiate with Marcus about accompanying him for questioning, Emma began to consider her options for publishing the story. As a freelancer, she had the flexibility to approach multiple outlets, and she suspected that major news organizations would be very interested in both her video and her first-hand account of what had transpired. The incident was also being observed by other palace security personnel who were discreetly documenting everything for their own reports. They understood that any assault on a member of the Queen's Guard was a serious matter that would require thorough investigation and appropriate response. The fact that the perpetrator was a wealthy businessman with political connections only made it more important that everything be handled by the book. Marcus finally seemed to realize that his situation was genuinely serious. His bluster and threats had failed to intimidate Thompson, and the continuing presence of witnesses meant that his behavior was being thoroughly documented. With obvious reluctance, he agreed to accompany the security officer for questioning. "This is a mistake," Marcus said as he began walking toward the palace's security office. "When my lawyers get involved, you'll regret treating me like some common criminal." Thompson didn't respond to the threat, but Emma caught the exchange on her recording. Marcus's continued defiance and his apparent belief that wealth should exempt him from legal consequences would prove to be additional elements that would make the eventual story even more compelling to readers. As Marcus was escorted away, James finally received permission from his commanding officer to leave his post temporarily for medical examination and uniform replacement. The spit on his tunic needed to be properly documented as evidence, and protocol required that he be checked by medical personnel to ensure he hadn't been exposed to any infectious diseases. Emma watched as James walked away with dignity intact despite everything that had occurred. His composure throughout the ordeal had been remarkable, and she knew that his professionalism would be a key element in the story she would tell. The contrast between his behavior and Marcus's could not have been more stark. While Marcus Whitmore was being escorted to the palace security office, Emma Richardson was already making the phone calls that would transform a single incident of wealthy arrogance into a national scandal. Her first call was to her editor at The Guardian, a woman named Sarah Williams who had worked with Emma on several high-profile investigative pieces over the past 3 years. "Sarah, it's Emma," she said, finding a quiet corner of the palace grounds where she could speak without disturbing other visitors. "I'm at Buckingham Palace, and I've just witnessed something that I think could be a major story. I have video evidence of a wealthy businessman assaulting one of the Queen's Guards." Sarah's interest was immediately piqued. Stories involving the royal family or royal institutions always generated significant reader engagement, and the combination of class conflict and assault had all the elements of a story that could dominate news cycles for days. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, and Emma proceeded to describe the entire incident, from Marcus's arrival through his verbal abuse of James, and culminating in the spitting incident. As she spoke, Emma could hear Sarah taking notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "And you have all of this on video?" Sarah asked when Emma finished her account. "Everything," Emma confirmed. "Clear audio and visual documentation of the entire confrontation, including the assault itself. The quality is excellent, and you can see everything clearly, including the reactions of other witnesses." Sarah was already thinking about how to approach the story. The Guardian had built its reputation on holding powerful people accountable for their actions, and this story seemed to offer a perfect opportunity to examine issues of class privilege and social responsibility. "I want you to file a preliminary story immediately," Sarah instructed. "Get the basic facts down while they're fresh in your memory, and embed the video. We'll run it online within the hour and see what kind of response we get. If it gains traction, we can develop it into a longer investigative piece." While Emma was writing her initial article, Marcus was experiencing what was perhaps the first genuine accountability he had faced in decades. The palace security office was a sterile, professional environment that offered none of the luxury and deference he had grown accustomed to in his business dealings. Detective Inspector Thompson sat across from Marcus at a metal table, with a recording device between them and a uniformed constable taking notes in the corner. The atmosphere was formal and official, making it clear that this was a criminal investigation rather than a casual conversation. "Mr. Whitmore," Thompson began, "I need to inform you that you are being questioned in connection with an alleged assault that occurred approximately 1 hour ago in the palace courtyard. You are not currently under arrest, but anything you say may be used in evidence should charges be filed." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Throughout his adult life, he had become accustomed to being the person asking questions and demanding answers from others. Finding himself on the receiving end of an official interrogation was a deeply unsettling experience. "This is completely unnecessary," Marcus said, his voice lacking the confidence it had carried during his confrontation with James. "What happened was a minor misunderstanding that's been blown completely out of proportion." Thompson consulted his notes before responding. "Mr. Whitmore, we have multiple witnesses who observed you spitting on Guard James Mitchell's uniform. We also have video evidence of the incident. Would you like to explain your version of what occurred?" The mention of video evidence clearly rattled Marcus. He had been so focused on humiliating James that he hadn't considered the possibility that his actions were being recorded by bystanders. The realization that his behavior had been documented was forcing him to confront the potential consequences of his actions for the first time. "I was frustrated," Marcus said, his tone becoming defensive. "I was trying to get the guard's attention, and he completely ignored me. It was disrespectful and unprofessional." Thompson's expression remained neutral as he made additional notes. "And you felt that spitting on him was an appropriate response to what you perceived as disrespect." "I didn't think about it," Marcus replied, the words coming out more quickly than he had intended. "It was an impulse, a momentary lapse in judgment. Surely that doesn't warrant all of this drama." As Thompson continued his questioning, Marcus's phone began buzzing insistently in his pocket. His personal assistant, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, had been trying to reach him for the past hour after receiving several calls from business associates who had heard rumors about an incident at Buckingham Palace. Jennifer had worked for Marcus for 3 years, and in that time she had become skilled at managing the various crises that seemed to follow in his wake. Usually, these involved business disputes or negative publicity related to his company's practices, but she had never dealt with anything involving potential criminal charges. "Mr. Whitmore," she had said in her voicemail, "I'm getting calls from reporters asking about an incident at the palace. I need to speak with you immediately to understand what's happening so I can manage the situation." But Marcus was unable to return her call, as Thompson had made it clear that the interview needed to proceed without interruptions. Marcus's phone continued to buzz throughout the questioning, creating an additional source of stress as he realized that news of the incident was apparently already spreading beyond the palace walls. Meanwhile, Emma's article was being edited and prepared for publication at the Guardian's offices. Sarah Williams was working with the paper's legal team to ensure that the story was factually accurate and didn't expose the newspaper to potential lawsuits, while the video editing team was preparing the footage for online publication. The legal review was particularly important given that Marcus was a wealthy individual with the resources to pursue aggressive litigation if he felt he had been defamed. However, Emma's video evidence was so clear and comprehensive that the legal team felt confident the story could be published without significant risk. "The video speaks for itself," the senior legal counsel told Sarah. "We have clear documentation of the assault, and the audio quality is good enough to capture the verbal abuse that preceded it. As long as we stick to reporting what actually happened and avoid speculation about his motivations or character, we should be fine." Sarah made the final edits to Emma's article, crafting a headline that would capture readers' attention while accurately describing the incident. "Wealthy businessman spits on Queen's Guard in shocking display of entitlement at Buckingham Palace." The story was published online at 2:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after the incident had occurred. Within minutes, it began generating the kind of social media engagement that indicated it was destined to become a major news story. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative toward Marcus. Comment sections filled with expressions of outrage and disgust, with many readers noting the contrast between Marcus's behavior and James's professionalism. The video was shared thousands of times within the first hour, with viewers expressing shock at both the verbal abuse and the physical assault. Dr. Amanda Foster, a sociology professor at King's College London who specialized in class dynamics and social inequality, saw the story shortly after it was published and immediately recognized its broader significance. This incident encapsulates so many of the tensions that exist in modern British society, she would later tell reporters. You have a wealthy individual who clearly believes his economic status gives him the right to treat working-class people with contempt and violence. The Guard's response demonstrates the dignity and professionalism that characterizes public service, even in the face of outrageous provocation. As the story gained momentum online, other news organizations began reaching out to their sources to confirm the details and develop their own coverage. The BBC, Sky News, and ITV all assigned reporters to investigate the story, recognizing that it had the potential to dominate the news cycle. Marcus's business empire was also beginning to feel the impact of the incident. Whitmore Shipping had contracts with several major corporations that were sensitive to public relations issues, and, within hours of the story's publication, some of these clients were beginning to express concerns about their continued association with Marcus's companies. David Chun, the procurement director for a major retail chain that used Whitmore Shipping for their logistics, received calls from both his superiors and the company's public relations team asking about the status of their contracts with Marcus's firm. The story is everywhere, Chin's PR contact told him. Social media is going crazy, and we're starting to get questions from reporters about our business relationships. We need to understand what our exposure is and consider our options. Chin had worked with Whitmore Shipping for several years and had always found their services to be competent, if expensive. However, he was also aware that Marcus's aggressive business practices and arrogant personality had always made him a somewhat controversial figure in the shipping industry. I'll review our contracts and see what termination clauses we have, Chin told his PR colleague. If this story continues to grow, we may need to consider our position. Similar conversations were taking place at companies throughout London as corporate executives tried to assess whether their association with Marcus's businesses might become a liability. The video footage was so damning, and Marcus's behavior so clearly indefensible, that many companies were beginning to distance themselves even before they fully understood the legal implications of the incident. Back at the palace, Thompson was concluding his initial interview with Marcus. The businessman's confidence had continued to erode throughout the questioning, particularly as it became clear that he was facing potential criminal charges that could result in a court appearance and possible conviction. Mr. Whitmore, Thompson said as he prepared to end the session, based on the evidence we've collected and the witness statements we've taken, I believe there are grounds to charge you with assault. However, the final decision will be made by the Crown Prosecution Service after they review our report. Marcus's face had gone pale during the interview, and Thompson's final statement seemed to drain what little color remained from his complexion. The reality that he might actually face criminal prosecution was clearly something he had never seriously considered when he decided to spit on James. What does that mean exactly? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It means you could face a court appearance, and, if convicted, you could receive a fine or even a short prison sentence, Thompson explained. Assault charges are taken seriously by the courts, regardless of the perceived severity of the physical contact. As Marcus was finally allowed to leave the palace, he immediately tried to call his personal lawyer, but found that his phone was overwhelmed with missed calls and messages. The story had exploded across social media, and journalists, business associates, and even family members were all trying to reach him for comment or clarification. His first call went to Jennifer Walsh, who answered on the first ring. Mr. Whitmore, thank God you're calling, she said, her voice tight with stress. The story is everywhere. Every major news outlet is covering it, and the video has been viewed millions of times already. We need to figure out how to respond before this gets any worse. Marcus could hear the tension in Jennifer's voice, and for the first time since the incident occurred, he began to understand the magnitude of what he had unleashed. What had seemed like a momentary expression of frustration had apparently triggered a public relations catastrophe that threatened everything he had spent his life building. What exactly is being said? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. They're calling you a symbol of wealthy privilege and entitlement, Jennifer replied. The comments are absolutely brutal. People are saying you represent everything that's wrong with class inequality in this country. Some are even calling for boycotts of your companies. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he began to comprehend the scope of the disaster he had created. Throughout his career, he had prided himself on his ability to control situations and outcomes through the application of wealth and influence. But this crisis was unlike anything he had faced before because it struck at the very core of his public image and social standing. We need to control this situation, he told Jennifer, though even as he spoke the words, he suspected it might already be too late. It be why the evening of the incident, the story of Marcus Whitmore's assault on James Mitchell had become the dominant news topic across the United Kingdom. The video footage, which showed Marcus's verbal abuse and the shocking moment when he spat on the guard's uniform, had been viewed over 10 million times across various social media platforms, making it one of the most viral news videos of the year. The public reaction was swift and devastating for Marcus's reputation. Social media platforms were flooded with comments expressing outrage at his behavior, with many users sharing their own experiences with entitled wealthy individuals. The hashtag #RespectOurGuards began trending on Twitter, accompanied by thousands of posts praising James Mitchell's professionalism and dignity in the face of such humiliation. Dr. Rebecca Thompson, a military historian at Oxford University, appeared on BBC News that evening to provide context about the role and significance of the Queen's Guard. Her comments would prove instrumental in helping the public understand why Marcus's actions were particularly offensive to many British citizens. These guards aren't simply ceremonial figures, Dr. Thompson explained to the BBC presenter. They are elite soldiers who have often served multiple tours of duty in dangerous locations like Afghanistan and Iraq. Many have risked their lives defending British interests around the world. To treat them as mere tourist attractions demonstrates a profound ignorance of their service and sacrifice. The historian's comments were shared widely on social media, adding another layer to the public's understanding of why Marcus's behavior was so problematic. Many viewers began to see the incident not just as an example of general rudeness, but as a specific insult to the military and to the concept of public service itself. Meanwhile, Marcus was discovering that his wealth and influence, which had always protected him in the past, were proving ineffective against the tide of public opinion. His first instinct had been to hire the most expensive public relations firm in London, but when he called their offices, he was told that they would need time to assess whether they could take on his case. Mr. Whitmore, the firm's senior partner, Victoria Sterling, told him during a hastily arranged phone call, "This situation is quite unprecedented. The video evidence is extremely damaging, and the public reaction has been overwhelmingly negative. We'll need to consider whether we can effectively represent you without damaging our relationships with other clients." The suggestion that even the most elite PR firm in London might refuse his business was a shock that Marcus struggled to process. Throughout his adult life, he had operated under the assumption that every problem could be solved with enough money and the right connections. The possibility that he might be facing a situation where his usual tools were ineffective was deeply unsettling. Victoria Sterling's firm, Prestige Communications, had built its reputation on managing crises for wealthy individuals and major corporations. They had successfully handled scandals involving tax evasion, business fraud, and even minor criminal charges for their clients. However, Marcus's case presented unique challenges that made them hesitant to get involved. The problem, Victoria explained to her senior staff during an emergency meeting that evening, is that the video footage is so clear and so damaging that there's really no way to spin this positively. Our usual strategies involve controlling the narrative or highlighting mitigating circumstances, but in this case, there are no mitigating circumstances. He was verbally abusive and then physically assaulted a respected military service member in front of dozens of witnesses. The firm's media strategist, James Crawford, had spent the afternoon analyzing the social media response to the incident. His findings painted a grim picture for any potential rehabilitation of Marcus's image. "The public reaction is unlike anything I've seen in 15 years of crisis management," Crawford reported. "Usually, we can identify segments of the population who might be sympathetic to our client's position, but in this case, the response is virtually unanimous. Everyone from military veterans to working-class families to other wealthy individuals is condemning his behavior." As Prestige Communications debated whether to take on Marcus's case, other aspects of his life were beginning to unravel with alarming speed. His business empire, built over decades of aggressive deal-making and strategic acquisitions, was suddenly facing pressures that threatened its very foundation. The first major blow came from Whitmore Shipping's largest client, a multinational corporation that accounted for nearly 30% of the company's annual revenue. The corporation's board of directors had held an emergency meeting that afternoon after receiving calls from shareholders and activist investors who were concerned about their association with Marcus's company. Richard Hastings, The corporation CEO made the difficult decision to suspend their contract with Whitmore Shipping pending a review of their vendor relationships. The decision was communicated to Marcus through a tersely worded email that arrived just as he was trying to formulate a response to the media coverage. Mr. Whitmore, the email read, due to recent events and the negative publicity surrounding your company's leadership, we are implementing an immediate suspension of our shipping contracts while we conduct a comprehensive review of our vendor partnerships. This decision is final and will remain in effect until further notice. The loss of such a major client represented a potential financial disaster that went far beyond the immediate embarrassment of the palace incident. Marcus had leveraged his business assets heavily to finance recent expansion projects, and the sudden loss of such a significant revenue stream threatened to create a cascade of financial problems. But the business implications were only the beginning of Marcus's troubles. His social and personal life, which had always revolved around his wealth and status, was also coming under unprecedented pressure. Marcus was a member of several exclusive London clubs, organizations that prided themselves on their selectivity and the distinguished character of their membership. These institutions had historically served as bastions of privilege for the wealthy elite, but they were also sensitive to public scandals that might damage their reputations. The Reform Club, where Marcus had been a member for over a decade, received dozens of calls from journalists throughout the day seeking comment about his membership status. The club's management committee scheduled an emergency meeting for that evening to discuss what action, if any, should be taken in response to the incident. Sir Geoffrey Pemberton, the club's chairman, had known Marcus personally for several years and had always found him to be somewhat abrasive but generally acceptable company. However, the video footage of Marcus's behavior had shocked even Sir Geoffrey, who had witnessed his share of entitled behavior among the wealthy membership. The incident at the palace represents conduct that is fundamentally incompatible with the values and standards we expect from our members, Sir Geoffrey told the committee. We have a responsibility to our institution and to our other members to address this situation decisively. The committee's discussion was brief and unanimous. Marcus would receive a letter the following morning informing him that his membership had been suspended pending a formal review process. While the club's charter provided for due process, everyone present understood that Marcus's membership was effectively over. Similar discussions were taking place at Marcus's golf club, his yacht club, and several charitable organizations where he had served on boards of directors. The video footage had been so damaging, and the public reaction so uniformly negative, that association with Marcus had become a liability that few institutions were willing to bear. At his Belgravia townhouse, Marcus was struggling to cope with the rapid deterioration of his situation. His wife, Patricia, had been fielding calls from friends and acquaintances throughout the day, many expressing shock and seeking confirmation about what had happened. Patricia herself was still trying to process how her husband could have behaved so poorly in such a public setting. "Marcus," she said as he sat in his study, staring blankly at his computer screen, "I've had to unplug our home phone because it hasn't stopped ringing. The reporters have been calling constantly, and even our friends are asking questions I don't know how to answer." Patricia had married Marcus 15 years earlier, drawn initially to his confidence and financial success. Over the years, she had gradually become aware of his tendency toward arrogance and his dismissive attitude toward people he considered inferior, but she had never imagined he was capable of the kind of behavior documented in the viral video. "How could you do something like this?" she continued, her voice a mixture of anger and genuine bewilderment. "How could you treat another person that way, especially someone in uniform serving his country?" Marcus looked up at his wife, and, for the first time since the incident, he seemed to fully grasp that the consequences of his actions extended beyond his business and social life. Patricia's disappointment and confusion were perhaps more painful than all the negative media coverage, because they forced him to confront the possibility that he had fundamentally misjudged his own character and values. "It was a mistake," he said quietly, the words sounding hollow even to himself. "I lost my temper, and I did something stupid. I never intended for things to go this far." But Patricia wasn't satisfied with his explanation. "You tried to humiliate him in front of everyone, and when he wouldn't respond, you physically assaulted him. That's not the kind of person I thought I married." While Marcus was dealing with the collapse of his personal relationships, James Mitchell was experiencing something quite different. The guard who had endured Marcus's abuse with such dignity and professionalism had become an overnight symbol of grace under pressure, and public support for him was overwhelming. The military hierarchy had responded to the incident with appropriate seriousness, conducting their own investigation and ensuring that James received proper support and recognition for his handling of the situation. Colonel Harrison, James's commanding officer, had issued a public statement praising the Guard's professionalism and reaffirming the military's commitment to protecting service members from such incidents. Guard Mitchell's conduct during this unprovoked assault exemplified the highest standards of military bearing and personal discipline. Colonel Harrison's statement read, "He maintained his composure and dignity in the face of verbal and physical abuse, demonstrating the character and professionalism we expect from all members of the Queen's Guard." The statement was widely covered in the media and helped to further contrast James's behavior with Marcus's. Public support for the young Guard continued to grow, with many people expressing admiration for his ability to maintain his composure despite such provocation. James himself was struggling to process the sudden attention his situation had attracted. As someone who had always valued privacy and preferred to serve quietly in his role, the media spotlight was uncomfortable and unfamiliar. However, he was gratified by the support he had received from both the military and the general public. In a brief statement released through military channels, James expressed his gratitude for the support while emphasizing his commitment to continuing his service. "I am humbled by the support I have received from the public and my fellow service members. This incident will not diminish my pride in serving my country or my commitment to maintaining the highest standards of the Queen's Guard." As the evening progressed, it became clear that Marcus's crisis was far from over. The initial day of coverage had established the basic facts of the case and generated massive public interest. But the story was evolving in ways that would prove even more damaging to his reputation and business interests. Investigative reporters were beginning to look into Marcus's business practices and personal history, searching for patterns of behavior that might provide additional context for the palace incident. What they would discover would transform a single moment of poor judgment into a comprehensive examination of privilege, power, and accountability in modern British society. 3 days after the palace incident, Marcus Whitmore's world had completely collapsed. What had begun as a single moment of poor judgment had triggered an avalanche of consequences that reached into every aspect of his life, both professional and personal. The investigative reporting that followed the initial story had uncovered a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus as a serial abuser of power and privilege. The Guardian's follow-up investigation, led by Emma Richardson and a team of experienced reporters, had spent 72 hours interviewing former employees, business associates, and service workers who had interacted with Marcus over the years. What emerged was a disturbing portrait of a man who had consistently used his wealth and position to intimidate and humiliate those he perceived as inferior. Sarah Martinez, a former administrative assistant at Whitmore Shipping, came forward with her own story of abuse at Marcus's hands. Sarah had worked for the company for 3 years before quitting in frustration over what she described as a toxic work environment created by Marcus's behavior. "He treated everyone who worked for him like they were disposable," Sarah told the Guardian reporters. "If you made even a small mistake, he would berate you in front of the entire office. He seemed to enjoy humiliating people, especially young women and anyone he thought couldn't fight back." Sarah's account was corroborated by several other former employees who had been afraid to speak publicly about their experiences until the palace incident gave them a framework for understanding that Marcus's behavior was not normal or acceptable business practice. Michael Roberts, a former warehouse supervisor, described an incident where Marcus had publicly fired a worker for taking a bathroom break that Marcus deemed too long. The man had a medical condition that required frequent breaks, but Marcus didn't care, Roberts explained. He humiliated him in front of all the other workers and then had security escort him out immediately. These testimonies began to paint a picture of systematic workplace abuse that went far beyond the single incident at Buckingham Palace. Employment lawyers who read the accounts suggested that Marcus's company could face significant legal liability if former employees decided to pursue wrongful termination or hostile workplace claims. The business impact of the scandal was accelerating beyond Marcus's worst-case projections. By Thursday morning, 3 more major clients had terminated their contracts with Whitmore Shipping, and the company's banks were beginning to express concern about outstanding loans. The shipping business required significant capital for equipment, facilities, and operations, and the sudden loss of major revenue streams was creating a liquidity crisis. Robert Sterling, Marcus's longtime financial advisor, requested an emergency meeting to discuss the company's deteriorating financial position. Sterling had managed Marcus's investments for over a decade and had always been impressed by the businessman's ability to generate profits and expand his operations. However, the current crisis was unlike anything they had faced together. "Marcus," Sterling said during their meeting in the abandoned offices of Whitmore Shipping, "we need to talk about some very serious problems. The contract cancellations are creating immediate cash flow issues, and the negative publicity is making it impossible to secure new business or refinance existing debt." Marcus sat across from his advisor, looking haggard and defeated in a way that Sterling had never seen before. The confident, aggressive businessman who had built a shipping empire through sheer force of will had been replaced by someone who seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crisis he had created. "How bad is it?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he feared the answer. Sterling consulted his notes before responding. "If we can't replace the lost revenue within the next 60 days, we'll need to begin laying off staff and selling assets to meet our obligations. The banks are already asking questions about our ability to service existing loans, and I expect they'll be demanding additional collateral soon." The financial advisor paused before delivering the most devastating news. "Marcus, there's something else you need to understand. The reputation damage from this incident may be permanent. Even if we manage to solve the immediate cash flow problems, it's possible that Whitmore Shipping will never recover its previous market position." While Marcus was grappling with the collapse of his business empire, his personal life was experiencing equally dramatic upheaval. Patricia had moved out of their Belgravia townhouse after concluding that she could no longer remain married to someone whose character had been so thoroughly exposed by recent events. The decision had not been easy for Patricia, who had built her entire adult life around her marriage to Marcus and the social status that came with being married to a successful businessman. However, watching the video footage of her husband's behavior at the palace and reading the subsequent accounts of his treatment of employees and service workers had forced her to confront truths about his character that she could no longer ignore. "I keep thinking about all the times I made excuses for him," Patricia confided to her sister during a tearful phone call. "When waiters complained about his rudeness, or when he screamed at repair workers who came to our house, I told myself it was just stress from his business. But now I realize it was who he really was all along." Patricia had engaged a prominent divorce attorney who specialized in high-profile separations involving significant assets. The attorney, Helen Morrison, had warned Patricia that the divorce proceedings could become complicated by Marcus's deteriorating financial situation and the ongoing criminal investigation related to the palace incident. "The timing of this separation could actually work in your favor," Morrison explained during their initial consultation. "If Marcus's business continues to decline, it's important that we establish your claim to marital assets before they disappear entirely." The criminal case against Marcus was proceeding through the British legal system with the methodical pace that characterized such proceedings. The Crown Prosecution Service had reviewed the evidence collected by Palace Security and had decided to formally charge Marcus with assault, setting up a court case that would likely take place within the next few months. Marcus's criminal defense attorney, David Blackwood, was one of London's most experienced barristers, with a reputation for successfully defending wealthy clients against various charges. However, even Blackwood acknowledged that Marcus's case presented unusual challenges. "The video evidence is extremely problematic," Blackwood explained during a strategy meeting at his chambers. "We have clear documentation of both the verbal abuse and the physical assault, recorded by multiple witnesses. Our options for defense are quite limited." Blackwood had initially considered arguing that the spitting incident was accidental or that Marcus had been provoked by the guard's failure to respond to his questions. However, the video footage made it impossible to claim the assault was unintentional, and the guard's professional behavior throughout the incident meant that any claim of provocation would be laughable. "Our best option may be to negotiate a plea agreement that minimizes the potential sentence," Blackwood concluded. "Given the high-profile nature of the case and the public interest in seeing justice done, I don't think we can avoid a conviction entirely." The legal proceedings were being closely watched by the media and the public, who saw the case as a test of whether wealthy individuals could be held accountable for their actions in the same way as ordinary citizens. The fact that Marcus was facing real consequences for his behavior had been welcomed by many as evidence that the British legal system could function fairly regardless of a defendant's economic status. Meanwhile, James Mitchell was adjusting to his unexpected role as a public figure and symbol of dignity under pressure. The young guard had received thousands of letters and messages of support from people around the world who had been inspired by his composure during the incident. Many of the messages came from military veterans who understood the discipline and self-control required to maintain one's bearing in the face of such provocation. Others came from working-class individuals who saw James as representing their own experiences with entitled customers or employers who treated them with disrespect. Colonel Harrison had arranged for James to receive counseling support to help him process both the original incident and the overwhelming public response. While the support had been gratifying, the attention had also been stressful for someone who had always preferred to serve quietly and without recognition. The hardest part isn't what happened at the palace, James told the military counselor during one of their sessions. It's knowing that millions of people have seen me at one of the most difficult moments of my career. I joined the Guard to serve with honor, not to become a celebrity. However, James was also beginning to understand that his response to Marcus's assault had created an opportunity to educate the public about the role and sacrifices of military service members. He had begun working with military leadership to develop a public speaking program that would allow him to visit schools and community organizations to talk about military service and the values that guide those who serve. The broader social impact of the incident was becoming apparent as well. The stark contrast between Marcus's entitled behavior and James's professional dignity had sparked national conversations about class, respect, and the treatment of public servants. Social media continued to buzz with discussions about privilege and accountability, with many using the incident as a starting point for examining their own attitudes and behaviors. Dr. Amanda Foster, the sociology professor who had provided early commentary on the incident, published a lengthy analysis in the Times that examined the broader implications of what had occurred. Her article, titled The Palace Mirror: What Marcus Whitmore's Behavior Reveals About Modern Britain, became one of the most read opinion pieces of the year. The incident at Buckingham Palace serves as a mirror that reflects some uncomfortable truths about the persistence of class-based thinking in contemporary British society, Dr. Foster wrote. While we like to believe that we live in a meritocratic society where everyone is treated with equal respect, this incident reveals that some people still believe their wealth entitles them to treat others as inferior beings. Dr. Foster's analysis resonated with readers across the political spectrum, many of whom recognized that they had witnessed or experienced similar behavior in their own lives. The article sparked additional conversations about the responsibilities that come with wealth and privilege, and the importance of maintaining respect for all individuals regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the incident had permanently altered the trajectory of both men's lives. Marcus's business empire continued to crumble as more clients canceled contracts and financial pressures mounted. Several former employees filed lawsuits alleging workplace harassment and wrongful termination, creating additional legal and financial burdens for a man who was already struggling to salvage what remained of his reputation and assets. The exclusive clubs and social organizations that had once provided Marcus with status and networking opportunities had all severed their relationships with him. The charitable organizations where he had served on boards had quickly distanced themselves, often issuing public statements emphasizing that his behavior was incompatible with their values and mission. Patricia's divorce proceedings moved forward rapidly, with her attorneys successfully securing a significant portion of the marital assets before Marcus's financial situation deteriorated further. The divorce was finalized 6 months after the palace incident, leaving Marcus alone and increasingly isolated as his former life continued to unravel. For James Mitchell, the incident had created opportunities for positive change and growth that he could never have anticipated. His speaking engagements had been well received, and he had begun working with veterans organizations to develop programs supporting military personnel transitioning to civilian careers. The royal family, through appropriate channels, had privately expressed their appreciation for James's conduct during the incident. While such recognition was not made public, it provided James with the satisfaction of knowing that his service had been acknowledged at the highest levels. A year after the incident, Marcus Whitmore was living in a modest flat in South London, his business empire gone, and his social connections severed. He had been convicted of assault and received a suspended sentence along with community service requirements that included working with organizations serving disadvantaged populations. The community service had been transformative in ways that Marcus had not expected. Working alongside social workers and volunteers who dedicated their lives to helping others, he began to understand how his previous behavior had been not just wrong, but fundamentally incompatible with basic human decency. James Mitchell had been promoted within the Queen's Guard and continued his service with distinction. He had also married his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, in a ceremony attended by many of the fellow service members who had supported him throughout the difficult period following the palace incident. The story of Marcus Whitmore and James Mitchell became a case study in business schools and ethics courses, used to illustrate the importance of character, respect, and the understanding that true leadership requires treating all people with dignity regardless of their position or circumstances. The viral video that had captured Marcus's moment of arrogance and James's grace under pressure continued to be shared and discussed years later, serving as a permanent reminder that our actions have consequences, and that wealth and privilege cannot protect us from the judgment of our fellow human beings when we fail to meet the basic standards of decent behavior.